Hello and welcome back again to Intro to Geology. We're kind of coming down now to the last couple of lectures before the third exam, the upcoming third exam. And so I hope you're staying along with this and going to be prepared for that exam. For those of you here on campus, as you know, next Thursday will be this third exam. It's going to be over in Tectonics Hall in room 127. That's the computer room. So be sure that you make a note of that in your calendar. Do not come here out of habit next Thursday. If you know someone who's not here today, be sure to remind them of that. I'll bring this up again next Tuesday in the next class period, so be ready for that. Okay. The last part that we're going to go into now, I've divided into two parts again, part one, part two, that deals with kind of a culmination of where we've been coming to with the physical aspect of this course. We'll have maybe one more physical related thing after exam 3, dealing with crustal deformation and mountain building, more of a structural geology thing. But plate tectonics is kind of this culmination of stuff. And again, I'm going to divide it up into two parts. The first part I'll kind of focus more on kind of the history, a little bit of the background of how we got to where plate tectonics is today, and begin some of the plate tectonic material, okay? And then, of course, on the second lecture, next class period, I will finish and wrap that up, okay? So I took this picture right out of your latest edition of your textbook. I think it's kind of a unique shot. It's a change since the last textbook. It really shows a part of the Earth where we not only can see climate differences, you know, the Sahara Desert there in North Africa, the Middle East, but also just kind of the patterns that you see in the topography. Kind of a flat open regions, the kind of mountainous zones that are curved and bent, and just kind of some kind of character to it that as you look at this you go, I wonder why that is. And that's a question that was asked by a lot of people about, you know, shapes of things, patterns that crop up as to continents as we were creating maps and learning more and more about the world. And once we got into space and looked down and took pictures, and once we actually sent satellites up there, we're getting all this new high-tech viewing of our planet, more and more of this picture is becoming clear. So I think it's a great photograph in your textbook to kind of start out this subject matter with on plate tectonics. Today, when we look at that planet a little bit differently, we actually now divide the outer part of the Earth up. It's really the brittle lithosphere of the Earth that we divide into parts. We call them plates, and we'll talk about a plate definition later on. And of course, we give names to them. And these white lines here represent the boundaries between it. If you look closely, you'll notice that some of these plates are solely and alone in an ocean. Some of the plate fragments are just maybe only parts of a continent, but many of them are actually a combination of both. They make up not only the continent, but also part of an ocean region. For example, the North American plate consists, of course, the North American continent. It includes Greenland, but it also includes all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean to that ridge we saw when we looked at the ocean bottom for the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where it actually crops out in Iceland. Very top central part just east of Greenland, you can see a little island there. That's Iceland. And so about half of Iceland belongs to one plate and the other half belongs to another plate. So we'll be looking at these and talking more about the names and the kind of plate boundaries we've got. But kind of before I do that, I want to talk about a little bit of the history where this came about. I started college in the 1960s, and when I started college, the concept of plate tectonics was just beginning to squeak into the literature and into books. Prior to that, though, it wasn't there. It came along very rapidly for some reason, and so I want to kind of outline it with you. But long before that, there was a totally different idea called Continental Drift. It was proposed in the early 1900s by an individual you'll learn the name of in just a moment. That pretty unique idea, but he didn't have a mechanism to make the continents move. And so it was kind of shot down by his colleagues. And nearly 50 years went by, and it wasn't until, because of instruments that were developed for warfare in order to search the seafloor and detect things in other parts of the globe, that the second concept came in called seafloor spreading. And once that data came into play, everything opened up again, and someone said, you know what, I think we've got our mechanism to make those continents move. And so these two ideas of continental drift and seafloor spreading got melded together and became what was known as the plate tectonic theory, or hypothesis at that time. And by the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't a hypothesis anymore, it was more of a theory. It's not a law, but it explains a lot of things quite easily because of this mechanism. So let's go back to the first one. Let's talk about the history behind this continental drift. The gentleman who proposed this at a national meeting was Alfred Wegener. And so since he first proposed it, we've given him the nickname of the father of continental drift. And since it was his ideas that really pushed things, and eventually led to, I guess, plate tectonics. They've now given him the nickname, the grandfather of plate tectonics. I'm not that concerned you remember whether this individual was a grandfather or father of these ideas or not. It's just that for sure he proposed this concept of continental drift. And we're going to look at some of the evidences he used to make this statement in there. As a scientist who was involved in a lot of different disciplines, geology of which was one of them, in studying fossils, in studying maps, in studying rocks, ages of rocks, types of rocks, patterns of rocks, stuff like that, he decided that, you know what, we could actually take these continents, like you see on a globe, take a scissors, cut them out, and put them together like a jigsaw puzzle. But he just didn't do it just on shape alone, that was one aspect, how they would fit, but also how they fit along the margins and what was involved with the rocks and the fossils and these patterns. And he named this large landmass Pangaea. Now you need to remember the name Pangaea. It was Wegener who proposed this concept of Pangaea, that all the continents work together as one major landmass in the geologic past. In fact, the word Pangaea means all lands. They were all tied together, okay? Now the picture on the bottom right from your textbook is kind of his sketch in the early 1900s when he first proposed this. The picture you see on the top is a more modern day representation of where we've come to be able to fit the pieces together because of all the new data that we have. And so he wasn't that far off. Really, really close. The only problem is when he said it split up and the continents moved, he didn't have a physical mechanism to make it move. And so the physicist and the other geologists said, well, we're sorry, that doesn't really fly. Yeah?
The word Pangaea, and it's kind of off the subject, but
yeah.
Does it have a German derivation?
That's a good question, and I don't know. Why don't we make that a class project? We'll dig it up. But anybody speak German in here? A lot of words I know come from Latin and other languages, but that I do not know. I'll certainly look it up and see if I can find it, but it could be Greek.
Was Wegener German though?
Yes. Yeah. Heritage. I'm German heritage to some extent, but I've got other lines in me from Alsace-Lorraine and Swiss and other stuff like that, yeah, but mainly. All right, here was his idea. You take this large landmass, and for some reason it begins to tear apart, split apart on rift systems. And he says, based upon the evidence of fossils and rock types that they could age date in their way at that time, he says around 200 million years ago it began to split up. That was his proposal, and began to move into different directions. And as it split up, it almost seemed to break into two parts, a southern kind of part and a northern part. And there were other scientists out there proposing similar things, kind of like what he was doing. They too didn't have a mechanism. The southern continent scientists from South Africa and Australia and South America, they named their landmass Gondwanaland. And the northern hemisphere scientists are North American and Europeans. Well, ours is called Laurasia. I'm not concerned you remember those two names per se. There's lots of other names we have for past chunks of continents that in a class like historical geology you spend a lot more time on, but you do need to remember Pangaea. And of course then it split up, began to move apart about 65 million years ago. There was some distance, there was kind of a proto-Atlantic Ocean. North America looks a little bit kind of like it, but there's no joining landmass between South America and North America yet, tectonically speaking anyway. Another thing that you don't see in this particular picture, running roughly through the middle of North America being, of course, up here, right in this region, from the Arctic down to the Gulf at that time, there was a shallow seaway, a Cretaceous seaway. It was maybe 800 to 1,000 feet deep, so that's not shown on this map at that time as far as detail. I have some others later on, either in this lecture or the next lecture that kind of shows that in detail. And eventually we are where we're at today. And they're still moving. And we can measure them. We know how fast they're moving. We know the directions they're moving. We can even model and predict where they might be in the future. I'll end with that idea in the second lecture on this. Okay? So continental drift, first suggested in 1915 by Alfred Wegener, and he based it on two main areas, on geology, of course, which includes rocks, rock type, rock ages, climate indicators of those rocks, and of course fossils. Paleontology is the study of ancient life in terms of plant fossils and animal fossils. Now it really wasn't, I guess you could say, fully embraced or believed or had enough support until the 1960s, when things from geophysics, like I said, the instruments we use in geophysics, and started studying the seafloor in more detail, of which we've already covered, and I will come back to that again. I said I would a little bit, see some of the pictures again. This idea of seafloor spreading came about. That's when all of a sudden people say, Wegener was right in that primitive map, and now we've got the mechanism with movement on the seafloor. That was the kind of the pushing or driving mechanism to make the continents move. I kind of like to think of it as a giant demolition derby. A red car, a white car, a blue truck, this and that, and they're all banging into each other, and pieces of paint and metal scrape off and get stuck to the other vans. Just think of those as rocks. And there might be an insect or a fly on that automobile or something that moves around. And now let's take a look at a list of some of these more detailed parts of this. First, there were continental margin fits, like if you cut them out of a map. The edges, especially with South America and Africa, kind of fitting in. That was kind of, well, yeah, that looks like it might fit there, but need a little more evidence just to say that it fits, like looking at clouds, say, well, that cloud could fit in that cloud. Well, if you look at the rock types along the margins of these zones in Africa and South America, and whether we did it in other continents too, the ages of those rocks matched up quite well. They had the same kind of age, as if somehow they just split and moved apart, but they were still the same age periods in terms of matching up not only the shape, but the age with that shape. Then to go along, even to add to that, the orientation of them. Do they run north-south? Do they run east-west? You could line them up like the rifling and matching a bullet to a barrel in a gun. That they had the same trend once you line them up. Okay? And then we started looking at the detail of the rocks themselves. Are these rocks that formed in warm climates, cold climates, dry climates, wet climates, in terms of like glacial conditions, glacial striation orientations, glacial deposits, a swamp that might have formed a coal layer, becomes like a big delta system. Aeolian refers to dunes, sand dune conditions, and of course evaporites refer to rocks that form by evaporating out of water, salt and gypsum deposits. And it's interesting that we find things like dry, hot desert deposits and evaporites, which are real hot conditions too, where the water evaporates away, in Antarctica. If Antarctica were always where it was in the cold polar area, why is it sitting out there with sand dunes from a desert or coal deposits from a humid, wet, equatorial region to evaporite deposits? Didn't make sense. But this is the stuff that Wegener looked at and proposed. He had a lot of support from this side of it, but he just didn't have a way of moving them at all. He couldn't make those giant, massive bodies move around the planet. So another picture from your textbook about how they would fit together. This talks about where parts overlap or there's a gap in terms of our being able to fit this together. And part of this has to, part of why we don't get them to match perfectly has to do with, well, things erode and change since that time, okay? Or we just don't have enough evidence yet. We haven't mapped everything 100%. That's part of what geologists do, go out, do master's theses and PhDs and study this. Keep working on putting pieces of the puzzle together, kind of the forensics of the Earth. If you look at the mountain ranges up in North America and in parts of Europe, even into Greenland and so on. And if we look at those ranges, yeah, they're nice that they're there now, but if we look at the ages of them and the structures in them, the orientation of these structures, if we put the continents back together like we see in the lower part of the picture there, they line up perfectly to matching trend, rock types, age of those rock types. It's just too much, it's not coincidence that it was like that. Here's a more detailed picture from the newest edition of the textbook again, being able to match these up. And this has all come about just in the last, this detail we're coming up with now is just the last 20, 25 years of research. More and more mapping. The glacial evidence, this would be when if the continents were back together, showing where they were positioned at one particular moment in time, and the glaciers spread out from a central position. They gouge and create those striations and grooves and stuff, and they deposit their rocks. And then, if they've moved today, here we've got huge glacial deposits in equatorial regions and striations that just don't make sense if the continents were always in those same positions. And then again, we also match the age of those glacial deposits up. So it's not just the scratches, it's also the age that we can calculate of those. Again, not a coincidence. There's one word up here you need to memorize or remember for sure, Mesosaurus. On the paleontological side, whether we looked at fossil vertebrates, and there are invertebrates as well, but, or some plants, I've listed some things up here that if we look at them today, they're very spread out, they don't make a lot of sense when we look at them in the rock record on different continents. They're kind of distributed anomalously. So if we were to look at the fossil record of a Mesosaurus, an organism on opposite continents, if you know your biology in terms of the genome, how species evolve through reproduction to have the same offspring, you couldn't possibly have the same exact animal, especially a freshwater reptile, same kind of fossils, found on continents thousands of miles apart if they were that way since time one. It's impossible in terms of reproduction to have the same exact thing in a gene pool do that. Unless, of course, this freshwater reptile decided to swim thousands of miles across the salty ocean to reproduce. As we look at the rock record and follow I don't know if you know what a cladogram is or a cladistics is in terms of looking at evolutions of species or plants of animals, kind of branching kind of diagram that they show. If you look at the rock record and go from old and follow it up through the geologic record, the evolution is parallel, exactly the same. All the changes are the same. The diversity is the same. But at around 200 million years ago, bam, they split off. That's just one evidence within the paleontological side to say that the continents drifted apart. The gene pool changed, Mesosaurus evolved into something else, and then eventually went extinct. But there was a divergence in the evolution and change within the morphology of these things after 200 million years, after the split, after the break. Again, there's no mechanism for it, but it's evidence to support that the continents moved, i.e. that they drifted apart. There's many other kinds of fossils that we could go into. These are some of the other biggies. Glosspteris is a type of plant, has a really large seed to it. Again, we know that seeds can blow around by wind and be transported or be moved by animals, but Most of the migratory treks were on a north-south line, and not so much always across oceans. And of course, there's an awful large seed in this case. So the same kind of pattern. And here's another one, Lystrosaurus. You see the same kind of evolutionary changes going on in their morphology, the skeletal makeup, and then at 200 million years it splits. It diverges in the rock record. So here we have a strict, I mean, this is a land-dwelling mammal. It can't swim. And so it's impossible for it to swim across from Africa to South America and have the same exact thing in the reproduction pool. It doesn't work. So again, the main one I'll probably throw at it, but what some paleontological evidence about Mesosaurus being a good thing to support the concept or the proposal of continental drift in this case. And again, I said there are many other types of these. Here's a picture of Lystrosaurus, interesting critter. Here's some of the Glosspteris plants, the leaves that have been preserved in the rock record. All right, now I want to shift gears out of that concept, and out of and away from Wegener right now, and talk about something else that came into play before seafloor spreading, but was beginning to open eyes up and minds up about another type of evidence to talk about continents moving apart. It has to do with the magnetic field of the Earth in terms of where's north? Where's the magnetic pole? In this diagram on the left is this idea that if the continents don't drift, what kind of paleomagnetic data is locked in the rock throughout geologic time? You start from about 500 million years up in these values and work your way back to where it is today. The magnetic North Pole is right here where this dot is. One of these represents data from rocks measured in Eurasia. This one on the right, the red one, represents data in North America. All right? We only have one magnetic pole, not two. But what if we put the continents back together like Wegener said, piece them together through all these moments of time? What happens when we do that? They all line up. So what was happening in the beginning was that we had this apparent magnetic polar wandering idea that didn't make sense. Okay? It wasn't the magnetic pole that was wandering, it was what? The continents wandered, not the magnetic pole. So, it's not a seafloor thing yet, it's still information that was being studied from a geophysics point of view, but they still didn't have a mechanism to move the continents. So again, a more detailed picture of the same one here, of no drift, and it gives us two magnetic fields which we know we don't have, and don't, in the rock record from paleomagnetic data. But if we line them up, they match real well. And the further back we go, they don't quite match up perfectly, okay? Because the data is not as good. The older you get, the poorer the data is in geology. Harder it is to unravel the history. Okay, so 40, 50 years go by. World War II is over. A lot of people in the Navy went into oceanography. Got all nice, neat, new instruments to measure stuff in the seafloor. Okay? At this time, a new hypothesis comes up in the 1960s called seafloor spreading. Spreading implies movement. Where'd they get their data from? Okay, well, one of the things they looked at was a pattern they were seeing in the magnetic character of the basaltic rocks that made up the ocean crust. Oceanic crust made of basalt. It's got an accessory mineral called magnetite, and that locked in paleomagnetic data, and they were able to measure the polarity